Well, welcome everyone. I'm Susan Bridges, the president of the Ponds Coalition, and thank you very much for joining us today for our 8th annual meeting. Members and volunteers, thank you for your amazing support. It's because of you that we're able to fulfill our mission to protect and improve the health of Brewster's ponds through science, education, and advocacy. And to hold a meeting like this to talk about our projects, programs, and accomplishments. I really believe that we've done a lot in 8 years, and we have a lot more projects planned, so thank you. And also, before I begin the meeting, I'd like to thank the Cape Cod Bible Alliance Church for generously offering their facilities for our meeting again this year, along with the help of Jim Van Ness, whom you just met, and his wife Leslie, and Samantha, who also is with the church and helped us with the audiovisual setup. And I'd like to acknowledge our Pond Hero business partner, Agway of Cape Cod, who is the sponsor of this year's meeting. By the way, they gave us 2 gift certificates that we're going to hand out at the end of the program. I think everybody's name is kind of in a bowl, and we'll choose 2, and 2 people will get a gift certificate for Agway. I'd also like to give a special shout out to Bill Pomeroy, who is taking photographs today. He's also a business partner. And I think a lot of his photos are maybe in the slideshow. So now I'd like to call the meeting to order. Reviewing the agenda today, I'll begin by introducing the board members, followed by a review of some of this year's highlights. And after that, we'll have a business portion of the meeting, which will include a short financial summary, acceptance of the minutes of last year's annual meeting, and board elections. And then next we'll have the presentation of the splash board, and then on to our keynote speaker, John Keith, who will be explaining what the Brewster Ponds Coalition is looking for in a comprehensive water resource management plan. You know, I just realized I forgot to introduce 2 more people from the town. We have Chris Miller here, the director of the Natural Resources Department, and Kim Pearson, who is the chair of the Board of Health, and also you are the chair of the Board of Health, right? No? Okay. Of the Natural Resources. No? Okay, I got that right. Okay. So let's go on to the board. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce our extremely dedicated and hardworking board of directors. So directors, please stand up and wave when I call your name so that everyone can meet you. John Keith, our vice president, and our Rob Condon, our treasurer. Nancy Ortiz is our secretary assistant treasurer. Marty Burke is chair of membership and co-leader of assistant membership. Ron Essig is co-leader of the citizen science team and Brewster Ponds Coalition representative on the Ponds Natural Resources Advisory Committee. Cameron Ferguson is chair of the volunteer committee. Kevin Kearns is chair of the Pond Outreach Committee. And Mary Matterstock is the chair of the events team and assistant marketing member.
Left out Marcia.
Oh, sorry. Marcia is chair of Pond Education. I'm so sorry, Marcia. I'm even like running down. I'd also like to introduce Jane Savio, who is our administrative consultant, who just started with the this spring, and Jane is helping us with communications, events, and eventually membership. And we are so lucky to have her. So, thank you. And also, I just want to go back to this slide. See how we're all smiling? We have places on the board for you too. So please consider joining us. I'd like to review some of the highlights of this year. I'll start with events. By the way, it takes a lot of work to organize all these events, but we feel that it's very important because they give us an opportunity to really reach out to the community, get to know you, and have you get to know us. They're also fun. So this year we have participated in 4 really wonderful town-wide events. The Eco Expo, the first ever annual Eco Expo, was held at the Museum of Natural History. It was sponsored by the Brewster Chamber of Commerce in February during school break, and there were over 20 exhibitors, many of which are our business partners. Then Beautify Brewster. In April, Nancy Ortiz and Marty Burke put together a team of 38 volunteers. Thank you to everyone that helped us pick up the trash. By the way, the town-wide volunteers picked up 3,144 nip bottles, which led to the passage of a ban on nip bottles in Brewster. So thank you for that. Brewster in Bloom took place on a beautiful weekend in the beginning of May. The Brewster Ponds Coalition not only had a table in front of the Brewster Bookstore, another business partner of ours, but we also participated in the parade for the first time this year. And it was a lot of fun, and guess what? We won the prize for most humorous. According to the judges, it was because of Shelly the Turtle, our very enthusiastic mascot. So if you look at this slide, you'll notice that Shelly is in 4 of them. She's very popular. Also, moving on to Conservation Day, held in July, there were 43 exhibitors, and the day drew over 1,100 visitors. Once again, the Brewster Ponds Coalition received the prize for the best exhibit with the big flush, a large model of a septic system that children and adults can crawl through to learn what can and cannot be removed by a Title V septic system. So this should not come as a surprise to this group. Guess what can't be removed? Phosphorus and nitrogen. So it's a really educational experience for all of us. Let's see. Also, I'd like to thank the AmeriCorps group who put together, well, first of all, they own the model. They brought it to the event. They took it down for us. So they did all the work, and we kind of got the glory. But also thanks to Conrad Schultz, who was terrific as Dr. Dan, the septic man, septic system man. He was able to flush over 120 kids through. And some went over and over, but I know that we used up over 120 stickers. Okay, moving on to the adult programs. We've had 3 adult programs this year, and we're planning 2 more for the fall. We started off with Kristen Andrus, who is the Associate Director for Education for APCC, who spoke about the importance of using native plants in our Cape Cod landscapes. This was followed by Amy Van Hoen, Director of the Brewster Board of Health, who explained the Board of Health's responsibilities regarding septic systems, and at that time, the proposed changes to Title V. Later in May, some of us got pretty dirty participating in a composting workshop given by Peter Jensen at Terra Firma Permagardens. He is also a business partner. And by the way, we're hosting another workshop next weekend to learn about how to create a hugel terrace. For the uninitiated, a hugel terrace stops the flow of stormwater runoff, directing it to gardens and capturing it in underground reserves. There are flyers on the table about this program if you want to take a look. I should also mention there are the minutes from last year's meeting on the table, and there can be a vote on that later, so you might want to take a look at that too. So moving on to fun outdoor activities, we're actually very well known for our fun outdoor activities. Hikes, so far this year Nancy Ortiz and Christy Donlinger have led 2 very successful hikes one in Nickerson State Park and the other in the Punkhorn. And Nancy has informed me that they're planning another one for the fall. Safari and Eco Paddles. We've also had 3 Eco Paddles led by Safari Adventures, a business partner, including 2 Herring Run paddles and a paddle at Long Pond. Bike rides. The bike rides are organized by Marty, and they're also a really big hit. Future rides are planned for the end of this month and September. So many thanks to everyone that supported these events as either volunteers or participants. And more events of all kinds are planned in the next few months, so check our calendar on our website for more information and to sign up. The annual Pond Summit, again co-hosted with the town of Brewster, drew over 85 participants, and the theme this year was septic systems and ponds in Brewster. What we do know, what is being done, and what is planned. The intent of the Pond Summit was to give our members and interested parties a review of the significant work that has been done to protect ponds, and with all the impairment sources were discussed, and the focus was on septic systems, which are estimated to account for 80 to 85% of impairment to our ponds and estuaries. A recording of that meeting, if you weren't able to attend, is on our website. So now moving on to programs. The Citizen Science Program is a signature program of the Brewster Ponds Coalition, and the team is led by Marty Burke and Ron Essick. The Cyanobacteria Water Quality Monitoring Project, in collaboration with the town of Brewster, APCC, the University of New Hampshire, and Limtex, is in its 7th year. This year involving 53 volunteers, and we are testing 19 ponds on a bi-weekly basis from May through October. The results are reported to the town. Of note this year is that although there have been some warnings of high levels of cyanobacteria in 3 ponds this year, the team is pleased to report that no Brewster Pond has had an official health advisory posted, which means don't use the pond. Citizen Science is also in its 2nd year partnering with the Cape Cod Commission, APCC, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration on a pilot project to determine if satellite imagery can be used to monitor the health and health of the pond and water clarity. Ponds in the 2023 study included Long, Seymour, Sheep, Upper Mill, and Lower Mill. A total of 50 to 60 tests are to be conducted at these ponds this summer. The 2022 Anatoxin A study tested a new method to isolate the smallest picocyanobacteria. The research took place at Lower Mill Pond and was in collaboration with Limtex. And it actually verified the presence of Anatoxin A in the samples. The results were published in the Journal of Water Resource and Protection in June of 2023. So now, in our 6th week, all citizen science research reports are available on our website under Programs Citizen Science. Pond education. Pond education for Brewster school children is another signature program of the Brewster Ponds Coalition. The program provides 2nd and 5th grade teachers at the Stony Brook and Eddy elementary schools with grade-appropriate pond kits, which include curriculum guides, lesson plans, classroom activities, and reference materials. The highlight for students is an end-of-the-year hands-on field trip to Long Pond. This year, 113 students, 16 staff members, and 15 volunteers participated. Lastly, the Brewster Ponds Coalition awarded $1,000 scholarships to 2 Nauset Regional High School students. Benton Caldwell will be attending Tulane University in New Orleans this fall, majoring in coastal preservation and sustainable architecture. And Sarah Cornell will be attending Cape Cod Community College for her first semester, and then transferring to the University of Miami, majoring in marine biology with a focus on environmental issues pertaining to lakes and oceans. Pond outreach. The Brewster Ponds Coalition is currently assisting several neighborhood groups with the remediation projects. Canoe Pond, we're helping with installation of a new aeration system. The Brewster Ponds Coalition is helping the neighborhood association navigate the necessary permitting process, and we will contribute 1/3 of the funds needed for the system, which amounts to about $10,000. The Beechwood Drive organization, Seymour Pond, they are updating the catch basins in the association's parking lot to more effectively capture stormwater runoff. The Brewster Ponds Coalition is helping to secure specifications and possibly bids from some of our business partners. And again, we can contribute 1/3 of the cost towards the project. Merrick's Pond is exploring the possibility of an aeration system. Also important is our Pond Protection Pledge Program. This, we hope, is really taking off at Seymour Pond, Upper Mill Pond, and Canoe Pond this year. The Pond Protection Pledge Program is a new initiative of the Brewster Ponds Coalition designed to engage and educate pond association, neighborhood groups, and individuals regarding specific actions that they can take to protect their ponds. Also, the Brewster Ponds Coalition is involved in an enhanced septic system and pond study right now. In partnership with the town of Brewster, we have launched a scientific study to determine the impact of septic systems on Brewster's ponds. The Brewster Ponds Coalition is interested in learning how nutrients move from septic systems toward ponds. The board has committed $75,000 towards this project, and we expect it to be a 3-year project. John will be telling you a lot more about this project during his presentation. Another achievement this year is that we updated our strategic plan. Our first strategic plan was developed in 2018, and a lot has happened since then. So the updated plan can be found on our website under About Us, that tab. But here are a few highlights. As part of our strategic plan, we updated our mission statement from protecting the health, beauty, and enjoyment of Brewster Ponds to protect and improve the health of Brewster Ponds through science, education, and advocacy. We also identified how we will measure success towards achieving this goal. First, a town program to annually monitor and report on pond health. Second, adoption and implementation of a comprehensive town-wide water protection plan that addresses nutrient pollution from septic systems. And 3, a community educated about the importance of protecting our water resources and willing to fund the projects needed to do that. So when we've accomplished all these 3 things, we can all go home. It's going to be a while though. Specific goals for this year: working with the town administrator and the select board, and I should say also the Water Resources Task Force, to sponsor an article on the town warrant to fund a town-wide comprehensive water resource study plan. Continuation and expansion of water quality testing and scientific research, working with neighborhood groups, the Department of Public Works, the Department of Natural Resources, and conservation on pond remediation projects, and educating the community about water quality issues and their critical role in protecting our important resources. So I hope you'll agree with me that we're making progress on all of these goals, but we need your continued help to keep it going. And now we're moving on to the business portion of our meeting, And I will turn the meeting over to Rob Condon, who will review our financial summary.
Thank you, Susan.
So this is,
That goes forward, okay.
oh, so let me go back. So that's your first line,
Okay.
and then you just,
You didn't send me this.
yes, I did.
Okay. Good morning, and thank you all for coming today. We've had the numbers speak for themselves. Let me just review 2022 very briefly. Our income from donations, general donations, and both from the public individuals as well as business partners, 73.5. The total expenses about 39,000. And we have the broken down our expenses into administration of 9,000, programs and projects of 10, education and outreach 17, and fundraising 1,000. And the total cash in the bank unrestricted is 179,000 at the end of 2022. Now, I think we have a slide here.
Oh, the other way.
Oh,
There we go.
okay. The total amount of grant program funds, which we call unrestricted, is 179,000. That's the big blue one. So the administration is about 4% of the total bank holdings, programs about 5%, education, outreach about 8%. The majority of education and outreach is actually the publication and distribution of our pond guides and our annual Ripples newsletter. That is one of the larger components. In the programs and projects, the largest component is the citizen scientist, and administration, the largest components of that are insurance, administrative costs, and accounting costs. And that kind of breaks down what it is. So there's basically 82% of our funding is available for grants. And as Susan just pointed out, we're looking at Canoe Pond, Merrick's Pond, Seymour Pond, and also everybody should be aware, she mentioned it briefly, that we have the 1/3 grant matching funds to approved projects for remediation, study, science, research. The largest one that we're going to be using this year, and it's already commenced, which we've spent so far about $10,000 on, and John will be talking about that, of a total of $75,000 spread over 3 years. And that is the septic study that John is going to be discussing. So that's a very, very significant spend. The entire board is committed to remediation, education, and advocacy, and we're putting our money where our mouth is, and it's a good thing, and we have to thank all of you for your wonderful donations and support to this happy financial report. Okay.
And now, if we could have a motion to accept the 2022 summary, financial summary, I need a motion. Thank you, and a second? All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Good, thank you. Our next bit of business is acceptance of the minutes for the 2022 annual meeting. There are several copies on the table in front of everyone. So again, if I can ask for a motion in a second. Motion? Thank you. Second? Thank you. All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? Thank you. Both of these motions passed. And now I would like to move move on to the annual election. In accordance with the bylaws of the Brewster Ponds Coalition, the election of directors takes place at the annual meeting of the corporation. The Brewster Ponds Coalition Board of Directors has a staggered three-year terms to ensure continuity of leadership. The current classes are Cameron Ferguson and Mary Matterstock this year, Marty Burke, Ron Essig, John Keith, Marcia Kelp, and Nancy Ortiz next year, and then in 2025, Rob Condon, Kevin Kearns, and myself. So, if you know, Cameron Ferguson and Mary Matterstock are coming up for re-election this year. Cameron, due to other commitments and personal circumstances, has elected not to accept another 3-year term on the board. So at this time, I would like to acknowledge his many contributions, including his work on the volunteer and scholarship committees, help with designing the grant program, assistance with numerous events, and his role as a citizen science volunteer. And although Cameron will not be continuing on the board, we're very happy to hear that he plans to continue as a volunteer on the citizen science team and also the scholarship committee. So please join me in thanking Cameron. We'll miss Cameron at board meetings. So our proposed slate, proposed slate of nominees. The nominating committee proposes the following slate for election to the Brewster Ponds Coalition. Re-elect Mary Matterstock to a 3-year term ending in 2026. So, do I have a motion to thank you? Second? Thank you. All in favor? Aye. That motion passes. Congratulations, Mary. So that concludes the business portion of our meeting. And next up on the agenda is the Splash Award. The Splash Award is awarded annually to a Brewster Ponds Coalition volunteer who has made a splash through his or her contributions to improve water quality, beauty, or natural habitats of Brewster's Pond. Nancy Ortiz is going to present the award this year to our very deserving recipient.
Splash Award, there you go. Okay, this individual has been indispensable to BPC. She has been a de facto leader of the Greenland Pond Citizen Scientist team for 4 years. In addition, she has been involved in numerous programs such as the annual meeting, the Pond Summit, Brewster Conservation Day, and Beautify Brewster, to name just a few. This past week, she set up the BPC library cabinet display 100% by herself, as no board member was available. And a few days ago, she was down in my basement organizing all the supplies for the annual meeting. She has been a great help on our hikes, jumping right in and speaking to the groups about borrow pits, cranberry farming, erosion, various plants found along the trail, etc. She even goes the extra step to research what she doesn't know. What is great about this volunteer is she takes initiative. She has always jumped headfirst in just about anything we need help on. If it's a BPC event, you are sure to see her there. Rarely do you find a volunteer as committed as Christy Dondliger. So please come up, Christy. She said she's me. That's okay. You did a great job.
Give her the award.
Oh, where is it?
It's right there. There you go.
For my wall.
There you go for your wall.
I'm not a public speaker, but I really have to say, when I found the ponds, I felt like I was coming home. I really feel like we can make a difference. The first person I met was Conrad. He picked up the phone when I called. That's so amazing. I didn't get the telephone tree. Next person I met was Marty. Marty has taught me so much. I really enjoy volunteering for the ponds. I want to do more. Thank you.
We'll let you. Where are we now? Let's see. Well, congratulations, Christy. And now, this is a public service announcement. This wouldn't all fit on one slide. So here's the top half, here's the second half. Here's the question. The town is interested in knowing how many of you received this insert in your water bill. Well, first of all, let me ask, how many people have town water? That's almost everybody. How many people got this in their last water bill? Okay, how many are on public water and didn't get it? Okay, how many people read it? It looks like just about everybody that got it read it, Kim, so. Okay, in the future, when you get your water bill, look for these inserts. Anyway, that was good. Next, I'd like to move on to our keynote speaker. I'm not sure John really needs an introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. John is the Brewster Ponds Coalition's Vice President and a founding member of the Ponds Coalition. John is a semi-retired environmental engineer and currently works on assessing and designing cleanup of toxic contamination sites in developing countries in Asia, Africa, and South America. His long career, including positions leading the health and safety programs for the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection and a major pharmaceutical company. John has a strong interest in helping Brewster develop a plan that addresses long-term water quality concerns, particularly controlling nutrients such as phosphorus and nitrogen that promote toxic algae blooms and growth of invasive species in our ponds. John lives on Elbow Pond and has led the multi-year plant harvesting project to improve the water quality at Elbow Pond. He has served as the Brewster Ponds Coalition representative on Peter Lombardi's Water Resources Task Force, and most recently was elected to the Board of Health. So John.
Good morning. You've heard Susan mention that one of our major objectives is what we termed, in the objectives at least, is comprehensive water management planning for Brewster. I want to make clear at the outset that we don't expect or require or even we're not demanding that we have a neat package all put together as one plan for Brewster. Instead, we're looking at a coordinated action plan that addresses all of the water pollution concerns in Brewster. We want the town to continue its work on protecting the waters of Brewster. It has been a priority of the town for some years, and I think that priority has actually increased That increase in the focus of the town is, one piece of evidence for that is that Peter Lombardi, the town manager, has pulled together a water planning task force, of which the Ponds Coalition sits on, and basically all the interested parties in the town sit on, to make sure we have that coordination and planning. As Susan mentioned, a key objective we have is to get more funding for water protection in Brewster. And we would like that funding sooner rather than later, preferably this fall. A substantial warrant in the town, a substantial article in the town warrant for funding. We don't have a specific estimate what we're looking at, though we want to develop that estimate. But I want to tell you that we're not looking at a little chunk of change here. Is it 100,000? Is it 200,000, 250,000? Something in that range. And it's not just 1 year. Water planning and the work needed to develop all the activities needed to protect our waters is going to go on for a good number of years. And finally, we want that protection of our waters, ponds, wells, the bay, estuaries, to continue to be a top priority for the town. We believe it is already a top priority for the town, and we want that to continue. We think that planning needs to consider all types of pollution. We've talked a lot about nutrients, but we need to consider pollution sources from septic systems, from surface water runoff, from natural sources such as birds or animals or just the acid rain, historic impacts, notably sediments at the bottom of ponds, and emergent pollutants like PFAS. We think that planning needs to consider all types of waters. First and foremost, we need to protect the quality of our drinking water, and I'll have a few comments about that. We need to protect our ponds. That's what we're here for. So a lot of this discussion I'll have this morning is going to be focused on ponds. But we also need to meet requirements that have been developed by the state to protect Pleasant Bay and other saltwater estuaries. And we need to continue to protect Cape Cod Bay from degradation due to nutrients or bacteria. As a side note, I was at Skakit Beach yesterday. Skakit Beach was closed to swimming due to bacterial contamination. Brewster beaches were not. That just shows, well, we had a 3.5-inch rainfall, and probably the source of the bacterial contamination in Skakit Beach is related to that rainfall with dog waste or bird waste or that sort of thing washing off of roads. But it does show that the bay is a concern too. We can't take it for granted that bay waters will always be protected just because we have a large tidal flushing. You may have heard that there is new septic tank regulations, septic regulations issued by the state. Those are primarily directed towards protecting saltwater estuaries, particularly along Nantucket Sound. We need to satisfy those regulations as well. That particularly affects the southern portion of the town that drains to Pleasant Bay, to the Herring River, which is basically Long Pond, Seymour Pond areas, and a little bit of the town that drains to Bass River. And we want the planning that the town needs to do to satisfy any requirements that are needed to obtain state funding or Cape and Islands funding. We want to maximize the ability to collect public funds to do the work that's needed. As I said, I'm not looking for, and the Ponds Coalition is not looking for a neat package, you know. Here is the master plan. We want to build on the previous plans that were developed in 2016 and other work, but we want this work to be coordinated. It's got to be integrated so that there's a lot of overlaps between all these different bodies of waters and different types of pollution. So it needs to be integrated and to consider all the different factors that affect our water quality. The work, as we said in the Pond Summit last June, the town has already done a whole lot of good work. They developed an integrated water management plan back in 2016 and have updated that. They purchased land around town wellheads to protect our wells and water quality. Did an extensive study on the mill ponds. There's been a lot of work to reduce pollution from storm runoff. The fertilizer regulation that Susan just mentioned and you got in the notice about with your water bills. Major input into the new state Title V and town septic regulations. Adopted several years ago a modified septic system regulation that basically says you need to be at least put your septic system, if possible, more than 300 feet away from ponds. And done a lot of work on the Pleasant Bay Estuary water permit and is close to meeting the requirements of that permit. The town is in the progress right now of evaluating its water sampling data in ponds. That's called the PALS data. They've been collecting that since roughly 2002. And an update and evaluation of that data is in progress. A lot of work done on the part of the town, and they're to be commended for that. But the work isn't done. There's a lot to go, and I'll be discussing that. We need to take a long-range view. What does the future look like in Brewster when we have full build-out of the town? What's it look like 10 years from now? How many people are going to live here, and what's the pollution situation going to look like? So that developing this sort of planning, this sort of roadmap for how we're going to address all the pollution threats in Brewster is going to require study and funding. That's why Peter Lombardi put together his task force, water planning task force. The action needs to consider cost and effectiveness. Is it really going to work to protect our waters? It needs to require further study. We know a lot about what's threatening our waters, but there's a lot that we don't know. In particular, and I'll discuss further, we don't fully understand, we know septic systems are the major impact on ponds and other freshwater risks. But which septic systems? Where? We don't want to pass regulations or have actions that require upgrading of septic systems where it's not going to help. But we do want to have regulations and upgrades where it is necessary and will help. We know that measures to protect ponds need to be pond specific. Every pond in Brewster is different. We've made mention of a few ponds where we've got projects going on, Seymour Pond, maybe Myrick's Pond, Canoe Pond, Elbow Pond, others. In each case, it requires a separate study, separate evaluation of what needs to be done. So it's a pond by pond sort of action plan. And there are many options that we have to consider. And you need to consider those in terms of both cost and effectiveness. And I'll touch on the tricky question of sewering towards the end. So as I said, we're looking for substantial funding. We're looking for a warrant on the town an article in the town warrant this fall that funds these sort of works. The town is including already on each warrant this fall and in previous years funding for various portions of these works. And my latest communication from Peter Lombardi indicates that they are including some funding in this proposed town warrant in the fall, particularly related to the new septic system regulations issued by the state, which is related, as I said, to the estuaries on the south side of the Cape Cod, Herring River, Swan River, and Bass River drainage areas. However, we think that the town probably needs to have more on the warrant than what is currently thought about, particularly funds in the warrant related to pond protection and the various studies that are needed. The town can, well, we all can walk and chew gum. We can work on the estuaries of the South Shore, and we can work on ponds. But it does take public support to do that. A few comments about drinking water. Certainly protection of our drinking water should be the top priority of the town. We need to have safe drinking water. As I mentioned, there are 6 drainage basins, there are 6 drainage basins of groundwater in Brewster. The southern half of Brewster drains towards Pleasant Bay and the Herring River and a little bit towards Bass River. And that's primarily, that is where most of our wells are, in that drainage area. The northern half of the town drains towards Cape Cod Bay and the estuaries on Cape Cod Bay, Quivet Creek and Namscape Marsh. You can see on this slide where the wells are. What is our view about water planning needs related to wells? Well, first, as was pointed out at the pond summit, the water quality in Brewster is excellent. It's extensively monitored. We have no PFAs in our public drinking water at the current time. The town has done a remarkable job in protecting wellheads by buying the land around it. Extensive lands, both in the Punkhorn and out on Freeman's Way towards in the area of Nickerson Park and the public fields out in that direction. The major source of toxics in Brewster is likely to be septic systems. We're all concerned about PFAs and other sorts of toxics, pesticides and that sort of thing, that could get and potentially reach the drinking water of Brewster. Brewster, unlike Barnstable, Falmouth, Mashpee, and some other towns, does not have a lot of industry, does not have a lot of firefighting foam that has been sprayed, such that, and those sorts of sources in other towns are the major sources of PFAs and other toxics. We don't have that in Brewster. It is likely that in our town, the major source of PFAs is what we put down into septic systems. So what do we need? What's the key needs that are ongoing in the water department? First of all, we got to say that these needs are largely being met by the water department. They are on top of this, and that's a good feeling. We need to understand what the volume of water we're going to need in the future. If our population keeps growing, we're going to need more water. Do we need another well? We'll need to see. We need to understand what happens when you pump all that water out of the ground. It changes the direction of flow. It changes the directions of flow going towards ponds. It may change the direction of flow and how much water is flowing towards private wells. That needs to be understood. We need to continue to assess the risk from PFAs. Just because we have no PFAs or other toxics in our drinking water at the current time does not mean that there is no risk. Those contaminants move through groundwater, and eventually the absorption capacity of the soils is used up, and they can reach wells, both public and private. So the assessment of the migration of toxics in Brewster is a continuing need. The water department, again, is well aware of this. And we need continuing public education about the need to prevent toxic contaminants from reaching our groundwater, which means pesticide use, limiting pesticide use in our gardens and lawns, and eliminating the discharge of toxics into our septic systems. So enough about the well protection. Again, the town is pretty well on top of this. There are continuing needs and continuing needs to fund that work. And I expect, and you will see in the town warrant, that they are funding the water department to consider those things. Let me talk about pond impairment. As you may be aware, there are 7 sources of pollution towards ponds. They're kind of shown in the arrows on this diagram. You've got some deposition, the rainfall coming down, whatever dust is in the sky can come down into the ponds. You have animals, wildlife, and hopefully not dogs, that their waste will fall into ponds. We've got storm runoff from streets, roads, lawns, and gardens. You've got groundwater flow, and the major contributor to pollution in groundwater flow, again, is septic systems. And you have some surface runoff locations. Particularly, I'll mention and discuss about cranberry bogs. Some of these sources are controllable, like septic systems and cranberry bogs. Some of them are not, like wildlife and deposition. In addition to the types of sources of pollution we have, there's different types of pond impairment, and they're listed here, and we've gone through these at a number of meetings before. Low dissolved oxygen, low clarity, high nutrients, harmful bacteria, chemicals, invasive species, and nuisance levels of plants. So in our planning, we need to consider all different types of impairment. Our key focus has been on nutrients, but that doesn't mean it needs to be the only focus. And integrated planning needs to consider all types of impairment. As I just mentioned, bacterial contamination at the bay is a clear possibility. It just happened at Skagit Beach in Orleans. There's a lot that we don't know about pond impairment. We don't know the current status of a lot of ponds. I mean, we kind of know visually. Slough Pond looks really good. Sheep Pond is great. Myrick's Pond has a real issue with clarity. We've got data from Marty Burks and cyanobacteria program that shows that most of our ponds, largely, almost all the time, do not have a cyanobacteria problem. That's great. But the overall status of most ponds, we have limited information about. We've been collecting PALS data since 2002, and as I mentioned, the town has now funded an upgrade in evaluation of that data, and hopefully we'll come up with a new status report on the impairment of ponds in Brewster, and hopefully a more sophisticated impairment status than the simple map that's shown on the corner of this slide. It's not simply a matter of good or bad or red, yellow, green. There's all those different types of impairment to consider and different types of sources. And a more sophisticated evaluation of impairment will take into consideration the different types and levels of impairment that happen. I can say that the overall conclusion, because I've looked at the PALS data, as a number of people in the audience here, some of the ponds are the same. Some of the ponds have gotten worse over the last 10 to 15 years, and virtually no ponds have gotten better. So we know that we have a challenge in front of us. We just can't let things continue to get worse. The causes of impairment. The extensive mill pond study that the town did showed that the issue is complex. Every pond is different. The cause of high levels of nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen, varies by pond. And the next slide, we'll get into that in a little bit. There's no generic answer. Here's the problem here's what we need to do that will solve everything in every town, every pond. We know that septic systems are a major cause of high nutrients in pond. But it depends on exactly where those houses are and a lot of other factors. We also don't know how much does cranberry bogs contribute to pond impairment. In the evaluation that we've done so far, we know that every pond that has a bog on it has some level of impairment. There are ponds without bogs on it that have impairment as well. But there is a correlation that seems to be that if you have a bog, there is some level of impairment. There is no pond with a bog that doesn't have impairment. So we need to think about what's the level of bog contribution. That's not an easy thing to evaluate, and bogs are protected in a lot of their activities under the state agricultural rules, so they have a lot more freedom of what they can do than a lot of us homeowners do. So, there's no one-size-fits-all for ponds. They need to be evaluated separately. In a lot of cases, source reduction of nutrients from septic systems or roads or fertilizers is not going to rescue the pond, is not going to eliminate the impairment. And that's because of the internal loading that's already in the ponds, the amount of nutrients, phosphorus and nitrogen that's in the sediments and the vegetation in the pond. So a quick evaluation of phosphorus sources in Cape ponds, and this was taken from data developed by Ken Wagner, who's developed the state lake management plan, and is an expert in these things. We've got all those different sources. Which ones are important, which ones are not? Precipitation, rainfall, is a significant source. The table at the bottom of the slide kind of shows Ken Wagner's view of a typical pond. And you can see that on the far right-hand side, he estimates that for a typical pond, about a quarter of the phosphorus level may come from precipitation, from rain, from the rain catching phosphorus from power plants and distant sources and falling into the pond. Groundwater flow is fairly constant throughout the year, but the amount of groundwater that's entering in any individual pond varies significantly. If you're at the top of the aquifer, groundwater is slow and there's not a lot of groundwater moving in. Top of the aquifer basically means in the middle of the cape. Slough Pond, Pine Pond, Sheep Pond. But if you're lower in the aquifer, closer to either Nantucket Sound or Cape Cod Bay, you're likely to have a lot more groundwater flowing into you. You've got a lot of coming down the hill at you. Groundwater flow, the contaminant source is largely septic systems. As shown here, so it varies greatly by pond. If there's a lot of septic systems nearby, then it's a major source of nutrients. If there's no septic systems nearby, it's not a major source. Storm runoff happens all year. How much storm runoff impacts any individual pond depends upon how many sources are nearby, how many roads are there that actually drain into the pond, how many lawns and gardens. That significant variation. But because of the change in the regulations that has eliminated phosphorus from most fertilizers, supposedly all fertilizers, but you can still buy some with phosphorus. And because of stormwater improvements on the sources, on the roads and parking areas that drain to ponds, this is generally a minor phosphorus source. That's good news. In most of the developed areas of the country, storm runoff is a huge contributor to phosphorus in fresh water. But in Brewster, it's a relatively minor source. I mentioned the questions around cranberry discharges. Most of that occurs in the fall. You're familiar with how cranberry bogs get flooded. And then when they're harvested the bogs, they drain it back out, and that carries nutrients with it. How many nutrients? We don't know. Significance is not clear, and we think that a study is needed on this. Wildlife inputs happens, of course, when the wildlife is active. It's a relatively minor source of phosphorus. And then there's the sediments in the ponds. That varies significantly by individual pond. Most of the release of phosphorus from sediments occurs when the water is highly stratified, when you've got warm water on the top and cold water on the bottom, and you're resulting in low dissolved oxygen levels at the bottom of the pond. Low dissolved oxygens promote the release of phosphorus from the sediments into the water. That occurs mostly in the summer, and according to lots of studies, but as reported by Ken Wagner here, that can be the dominant source of phosphorus in the growing season, basically right now. You can see his typical example. It's showing close to 40% in the summer of the loading of phosphorus can come from sediments. Again, a major variation by pond. Source control upgrading the septic systems, moving them far away from ponds, all the stuff we can do at roads, reduction of fertilizers and the like, protects ponds, but it rarely remediates the ponds once they're impaired. Source control rarely counters all of the effects of pollution, all the pollution sources that impacts ponds. You can reduce the phosphorus from septic systems, but you can't get it to zero. You can reduce the phosphorus from cranberry bogs or storm runoff, but you can't get it to zero. As shown on the previous slide, typically 25% of the phosphorus loads may come from internal sources, from the sediments at the bottom. In-pond actions are almost always needed once the pond is impaired. And those actions are on a pond-by-pond basis. The alternatives that we have to address once the pond is impaired, we've discussed this at a variety of meetings, but basically we can go to aeration. That prevents low oxygen levels at the bottom of the pond and therefore reduces the amount of phosphorus that comes out of the sediments in the growing season. We can add alum that precipitates the phosphorus out of the water column and leaves it at the bottom of the pond in a biologically unavailable form, at least for a number of years until that precipitate breaks down. There's macrophyte harvesting, which is remove the plants. All plants contain phosphorus, all living cells contain phosphorus, 0.2% or something in that range. If you remove enough of that, the plants, then you're removing the phosphorus from the ecosystem. There's other alternatives available, such as dredging, which is really not practical for Cape Cod ponds, and in some cases biomanipulation. But all of these alternatives need to be considered on a pond-by-pond basis. So you can see the boat analogy at the bottom. Once you've got a leak in the boat, it doesn't help to bail the boat. You need to fix the leak first. But you can fix the leak and it doesn't help you because the boat's already filled with water. So the pond analogy is we need to fix the leak, we need to fix the sources, but we also need to raise the boat. We need to do the in-pond work so that the boat floats again and the pond is not impaired. We'll move on to septic systems. What do we know about septic systems? We know a whole lot. We know how much nutrients the average person puts out into a septic system every day as a result of waste, toilet use and laundry use. There's good factors. You can estimate exactly how much you individually put out into your septic system every day. We have good data about how much septic systems reduce nitrogen and phosphorus, 15 to 25%. We know that septic systems that are close to and upgrading to ponds have a major impact on ponds. You can go to any number of lakes where they've got summer cottages that are 40 years old that were built right at the edge of the pond, and you'll find major pond impairment. Lots of studies that shows that that's the effect when that you get impaired ponds when you've got a lot of houses upgrading close by. We know that if the houses are close to the groundwater level, there's not a lot of dirt and sand below the septic system before it hits, the wastewater hits the groundwater, results in more impairment. We know that the older a house is, the longer the people have been living there, the more nutrients have been released into the ground and the groundwater, and the more likely that has traveled that those nutrients have traveled some significant distance. We know phosphorus is well absorbed in soil. It doesn't move very far or fast, but eventually the absorption capacity of the soil is used up and the phosphorus will move. We know that nitrogen does move much faster and more effectively through groundwater, in groundwater than phosphorus does. Nitrogen is the critical nutrient in our estuaries, and that's why the state has passed septic tank regulations that are focused on nitrogen. And we know that septic systems in areas where you don't have a lot of industry or airports or firefighting foam that's been sprayed are probably the major source of PFAS and other toxics. So that's what we know. What do we not know? What don't we know about septic systems impact? We can't answer definitively the question, how far away does a septic system need to be from the pond to have no impact on it? The rule of thumb on that is that 300 feet is a safe distance. If you're 300 feet away, then it will take 50 years or more for the phosphorus to reach the down gradient pond. That's the rule of thumb, but that's based on studies that go back to the 1980s and 1990s, and they weren't done on Cape Cod. There's a lot of factors that influence how far and how fast nutrients move, how phosphorus moves in groundwater, how old the house is, how far away is it from the pond, how high is it above the groundwater, how many people are in the house. You get a lot more waste out of a house with 6 people than you do with a house with 2 people. Is it year-round or summer only? What's the iron and manganese levels in the soil? Iron and manganese absorb phosphorus and prevent it moving. Lots of iron and manganese, that phosphorus is not going to move very far at all. Low levels, you're going to have a lot less absorption and a lot faster movement. And what's the overlap between septic systems? How many are in the area? The actual distance of septic systems that impact ponds likely vary significantly in Cape Cod. This is also true with toxic discharges. We don't know a lot of good data about how much comes out of a septic system, but we do know that it varies dramatically on the number of people in a house, and particularly the practices that are used in the house. What do they dump down the drain? But not a lot of good data as to what those averages, and not good planning data on what we should do about that. The Ponds Coalition has undertaken a study to answer some of these questions. We've recruited 4 of our members' houses, 2 on Elbow Pond and 2 on Griffith Pond, to evaluate these factors. The houses have various numbers of residents, from 1 to 3. The average house in Brewster, by the way, has 2.1 residents. So, different numbers of residents, different distances from that leach field to the ground water level, different distances to the pond, different ages of the house. And hopefully by studying this, we'll have a much better idea to answer some of those questions on the previous slide. And this will help assure that any measures that we are recommended for upgrading of septic systems are focused on the problem and not on systems that don't cause the problem. I wish I knew the answer, but we don't know what the answer is going to be. I'm going to bet it's going to be different than the 300-foot rule of thumb, but I can't tell you exactly how much different in which direction. We've committed $75,000 to this study. The study has been started. We can go out on Monday and actually start doing some testing at the first wells that were drilled around the septic systems on Elbow Pond. It'll take a year to evaluate it because we'll be sampling every quarter. We want to see the changes. The changes will tell us the rate of movement of nutrients through the soil. This is a major study. There is a huge amount of interest in what the results of this. When we announced that we wanted to do this study, we had input from the U.S. Geological Survey, from the U.S. EPA. We're being assisted on the study by the Massachusetts Alternative Septic System, run by Barnstable County. Even the town's consultant, major interest in it. They're so interested that they're actually donating a lot of their own time, pro bono. Thanks to Horsley Witten for doing that. Other towns have asked already, what are you doing and what sort of study, what's going to come out of this? So a lot of interest in what this study is going to show. This isn't the end of the stuff that we need to study. We certainly need to ask the question, what about when you have many septic systems upgrading into the pond? And what if they're really old? Cobb's Pond is an example. It's downgrading to the center of the historic town in an area that's been developed for hundreds of years. What's the impact? That's probably something that needs to be studied further, and something that we'll probably get to next year. So there's a lot of work to be done on this. And when we talk about funding on a town warrant, it's this sort of study that needs to be incorporated, this sort of answering these sort of questions that needs to be evaluated. So what is our view as to the work that's needed in Brewster? We need to complete the analysis that's been started on the historic data. There's lots of data out there. Complete analysis of PALS data. We need to conduct a pond-by-pond review to update what the impairment status is for the various different types of pollutants. We need to evaluate the impact of Brewster houses on the Herring River estuary, which is basically Long Pond, Seymour Pond, Hinkley Pond, and the Herring River down gradient from there. That's required by the state. There's a lot of historic data already available. How many houses are in that drainage area? How old are they? And we need to evaluate existing data related to the bay. We've got lots of information about how many houses are there. We can calculate what sort of nutrient levels are produced that are likely impacting the bay, particularly nitrogen impacts of the bay. The bay evaluation has in general been focused mostly on bacterial contamination, but that needs to be an ongoing study. The nutrient levels in the bay have historically been very low because of the enormous amount of tide. You get a 10-foot tide that comes in and covers the flats every day and then flushes whatever's accumulated out to sea. That's great, we get a lot of protection from that. That is not lifelong protection. That doesn't mean that tidal flushing will protect the bay for all time. There are many areas in the world where you have similar situations and where you have nutrient impairment. The town needs to continue the work required on the Pleasant Bay permit. They've made a lot of progress in fulfilling the commitments for nitrogen reduction that's flowing to Pleasant Bay. And then we'll need to address the state requirements to exempt the Bass River and Swan River watersheds from the Title V regulations. So they're already thinking that that sort of funding needs to be on the town warrant, and as it does. So we need funding for the septic system impact evaluation. Our study and the Ponds Coalition will help answer the questions, but it's not going to finish the job. There's a lot more evaluation work that will be needed to be done. Hopefully we'll be able to develop some realistic factors about how much septic systems actually impact ponds, reflecting the different factors like occupancy, age of houses, distance from ponds, and elevation. We are suggesting that when we come out of these various studies, you'll have two different types of scenarios. One is the reality. 2.1 people per houses. This is the typical distance of septic systems above the groundwater, their elevation above groundwater. Use that for planning and development of regulations so that we have realistic regulations as to which that only regulate those septic systems that impact ponds. There's a different case, the regulatory case, that would apply for new construction, and probably more severe. New construction would probably need to take a more detailed and severe look at nutrient reduction. Pond assessments. The town has done good work on Mill Pond. There's been evaluation on a good number of other ponds. Schoolhouse, Long Pond, and others. There has been case-by-case work in a number of different ponds. But we would like to see pond assessments get a higher priority. We need to have a coordinated plan as to how we're going to assess the health and impairment level and the actions needed to protect ponds. These need to be done on a case-by-case basis. We would like to see these prioritized. I'll talk about that on the next slide. Clearly, we need to use available data, maybe further sampling. PALS data may not be adequate for the characterization of ponds. We would like to see a template, an easy way to do the pond evaluation using various different standard factors. And the Ponds Coalition would like to help the town, working with other towns, because every other town has the same need, to evaluate ponds so we can get this done efficiently and not just every pond on a one-off basis starting from scratch. If we have a common template, we could do a lot more ponds reliably and quickly. We need to have better understanding about bogs, so we would like to see some sort of study about the input from bogs. I've done some literature review to see what the state has on that, and unfortunately it is very limited. Another area that the Ponds Coalition has an opportunity to contribute. So pond assessments, you put that template together, you factor in the number of houses upgrading close enough to impact ponds, the impact of lawns and roads, streams, bogs, and the like, and develop an overall nutrient budget for the ponds upon which you can make decisions about which pond is impaired and what sort of alternatives can protect ponds. Our suggested priority is that great ponds with a lot of public access and regular use for swimming should be at the top of the list for evaluation. That the second priority would be smaller ponds with public access or regular usage for swimming and other recreation. Some of them listed are here. we would like to see the funding that we're talking about for a town warrant at least cover these top two priorities. The lower priorities, the ponds that have very little usage for swimming, and smaller ponds with very little access would need to be done in the future, or perhaps using private funds. But when we talk about what funding we want in the next several years, it's those top several priorities. We need to look at the strategy for ponds. If it's impaired or likely to be impaired, what's the answer? Can it be protected or improved using only source control? If yes, good. What septic systems do we need to address? If it can't be addressed just by source control, then we need to look at what the remediation measures might be. Whether that's alum, aeration, macrophyte harvesting, or whatever, in addition to source control. And then for each individual pond, refine cost estimates for the best alternatives for remediation and protection of that individual pond. So that's a piece of work, it's a scientific evaluation that needs to be funded as well. Town funding needs to also address the Herring River and Bass River estuaries to meet the new regulations that the state has imposed. There are time deadlines on those assessments that need to be met. We have several years, basically 2 years from July to state that we want a watershed permit or to be part of a watershed permit for those estuaries. And then once we indicate that we want to be part of a watershed permit, there is work to be done to develop that watershed permit as kind of listed here, and that needs to be funded as well. And finally, the bay and bayside estuaries, not to take it for granted that they will always be okay. There needs to be some funding to evaluate where we are. There's a lot of sampling data. We know that right now they're not impaired, at least related to nitrogen, but we need to consider both nitrogen and bacterial risks, and not take it for granted that we'll be all okay. The long-term planning and the major work that might need to be done on Cape Cod Bay is further down the road. It's not listed as an impaired waterway by the state DEP at the current time, and likely won't be for a number of years. So at some point, we'll have to be back to Cape Cod Bay to protect it. We're probably not there yet, but we need to start planning and evaluation to see when we will get there. And finally, you've got all these different areas to look at: wells, ponds, Pleasant Bay, Herring River, the Cape Cod Bay, and the groundwater is the same groundwater that affects all of them. What's the overlap? How does they all fit together? How does protecting one thing protecting a pond protect the bay? How does protecting wells protect ponds? How do we integrate this planning? We'll need to, this comprehensive planning that we're looking at we need to include the interactions and the integration of all of these different sources and types of water bodies. This isn't a neat package when you're done with it. Here's the comprehensive water plan. You're probably going to have one section for wells, you're going to have one section for ponds, you're going to have another section for the bay, but you need to at least consider the interactions so that the planning is coordinated, even if they're in separate documents. But the documents that are prepared need to be put together in a format that's suitable to get funding from the Cape and Islands Fund and the State Revolving Fund. So there is some regulatory requirements to satisfy. All of this work is likely to take a number of years. Some of the work needs to be done more quickly. We already have commitments related to Pleasant Bay. But we're suggesting that, you should at least have a target. How long was it going to take? And we're kind of suggesting a target of 3 years to put all of these different factors together, particularly for the top 2 categories of pond assessments. I'm going to digress for a moment and talk about sewers, because I get that question pretty frequently. Do we need sewers in Brewster? There is no clear answer on that. The densest area of development in Brewster is, not surprisingly, north of 6A, and major housing developments, some of them south of 6A, particularly from Paynes Creek to roughly Ellis Landing. All of those areas, a lot of those houses, small lots, septic systems, likely significant nutrient discharges that are impacting the bay. The bay is not impaired at the current time, at least regarding nutrients. But with that sort of development and the experience that you have in other shallow water estuaries, even with significant tidal flushing, they find that eventually impairment will happen. So even aside from the issue of ponds, at some point, it is my view, not the pond's view, just my own view, that we have a significant risk that sewering might be needed at some point. So in the long-term planning, you need to think about the impact on the Cape Cod Bay. We also need to think about if sewers were to be needed, not only where would they be located? Clearly, the densest areas of development are the best candidates for sewers, but where would you put the sewage treatment plant? Sewage treatment plant needs to go back inland because the discharge goes into groundwater to replenish the water that we're taking out of the groundwater in our various wells. So locations for that sort of thing is a consideration. There are a good number of locations to think about in Brewster. But I don't think sewering is off the table. Brewster is often thought like we're an exception. We don't need sewering here, but every other town in Brewster, every other major town in Cape Cod is going ahead with sewers and sewage treatment plant. Either they have it or they're planning it. Chatham, Orleans, Harwich, Dennis, Barnstable, Falmouth, Mashpee, all have or are moving forward with sewers. For us to think that we are that unique, that it will never happen here, is maybe wishful thinking. Again, that's my personal view. So that's an overview of what we think we need. There's a lot to be done. There's study and evaluation on ponds, on septic systems. There's integrated planning that needs to be done. There's state requirements to be met related to Pleasant Bay and the Herring River watershed. We hope that our members will support the inclusion of an article in the next town warrant to fund this work. Again, substantial funding. The purpose of this discussion really is one of education and building support. Again, we're not criticizing the town in any way for what they've done, but we would like to see this work accelerated and moved to the top priority, and we hope that our members will support that sort of inclusion of a warrant. So thank you, and we'd be happy to get questions.
At least once a year, helicopter arrives on Elbow Pond and sprays on the cranberry bog. Don't know what they're spraying. I don't know if you know what they're spraying. And there's no warning that you should stay into, I don't understand it. I've been living on Elbow Pond for over 50 years. I don't know if the helicopters have been coming 50, but at least for the last decades. And they come early in the morning. Most people are asleep early in the morning and don't know they're there. So I say maybe it's once a year, but I think it's more than once a year. So my question is, what is the content of the spray that goes into the pond?
They're spraying pesticides. The applicators are licensed. It's not only Elbow Pond bogs, it's any well-managed bog. Cranberry bog on Cape Cod uses pesticides. There's some sort of larval worm that they're very concerned about. I don't know the details of it. I know that the applicators are licensed and regulated. And yes, under the state agricultural rules, they don't require notification of the surrounding people. They are supposed to be spraying bogs on sunny days when no rain is in the forecast, when winds are very light. Spraying, helicopter spraying is not the only way to do it. You can do land application in various different ways as well. How much of that pesticide runs off into our waters? We don't know. Clearly it depends upon the practices, it depends upon what is the half-life, the biological life of the pesticides. Some of the pesticides degrade rapidly in sunlight and water within a couple days. Some of them take months, some of them take years. As I understand it, the pesticides that are going on bogs in Cape Cod are in that several day to several month time period for a half-life. How much of that residue that are on the cranberry bogs washes out or washes down into the groundwater with the next rain? Don't know. So lots of questions. It's no indication that anything illegal is being done. It's all regulated. But what's the impact on ponds? It's an area that needs to be evaluated. Yes?
Great presentation. Considering that global warming, climate change is going to continue, as most scientists believe, and as we've seen here in some of the slight changes but persistent of heavy rains with flooding and everything else, which they also assume is going to continue and is continuing around the country in areas that never got rain. Is the changes that climate change is bringing be considered in this plan?
Well, thank you. So far, no. But there's no question that the waters are warming. Certainly bay waters and Nantucket Sound are warming, but ponds are, well, we'll see with the PALS evaluation. They've been monitoring temperature for decades now, and we'll get some evaluation of what the temperature changes is, not only at the surface, but the temperature profile going down to the bottom. So when the PALS evaluation is done, we'll have a better answer of how much that has changed. I expect it is getting warmer. Warmer waters will have an ecological impact, absolutely. Will it change the nutrient balance? How much is coming out of the sediments? Likely. Will it change the biota? You know, with the cephalopods and the bacteria and the algae and the balance and the nutrients required for those different items in the biota? Yes, it will. How much and to what extent? Don't have an answer to that. Will it change the amount of nutrients that come from precipitation? Probably. So there's a lot of unanswered questions about how climate change will impact ponds in the future. It's going to be difficult to answer exactly what those are, but that doesn't mean we need to ignore it. We need to pay attention to it. It does mean that the solutions that we come up with for protected ponds need to be robust, not just barely get there to the end point, but to get there with some margin of safety to take climate change into impact. So that's a big outstanding question. In the back.
I have two questions for you. Just follow up. When we're looking for town funding and possible warrant, is there a consideration to request a CPC funds?
So
That's the first question.
I'm not able to hear you, so.
Oh. When the group is looking to ask the town for funding and a warrant to look for funding to study the ponds and the water, is there a consideration to request the CPC, the Community Preservation Committee funds within the town? Because from my understanding, that might be a source for some joint funding. And the second question was, you mentioned the sewers. Is the town at all discussing looking at sewers? And that's my two questions.
The preferred way for the Ponds Coalition is to develop a warrant in cooperation with the town, to have the town develop a warrant. The Water Planning Task Force, well, this presentation has been shared with them. We've got several representatives of that group here. So they have some idea what the Ponds Coalition would like to see. It's not a surprise to the town what we would like. And we would like to develop that warrant in discussion with them. Sources of funding need to be evaluated, whether it can be community development funds or general revenue or whatever sources. I'm certainly not an expert in the funding sources. One reason why we don't want to put a specific number as to what's needed is because we want to work with the town as to what sort of funding mechanisms are out there and how much they think is needed before we, say, here's what you got to do. But we have a limited amount of time to do that and to come up with some sort of number and funding mechanism if we want to meet the town, get something on the fall warrant. So, kind of 50-50 answer to your question.
I'm gonna take this one and bring it back to you so that you have the next question.
Okay.
This is a
Other-
snafu, but we're trying to, work with one mic. There's another question, I think, back there, right? You have a question? I do. I'm gonna bring the mic to you so everybody can hear it, and then I'll take it back to John to reply. Okay, let's start.
The emphasis with the septic systems, I always think of myself as being environmentally aware. However, I was told by the person that was pumping my septic tank that I was putting things down, and clearly at some point in my life, I had lived where there was a sewer. And so I think that we need some very, very clear education, and including, if you say, a lot of the issues around septic are near, are places that would be rented out. I would strongly encourage the Brewster Ponds Coalition to have something that people could put on their refrigerator that said, please don't throw these things down the sink, because I found out I was throwing things down that should never have been thrown down the sink. And just one other thing on the warrant, I think, and this isn't my opinion, but I think you will be asked, or the people will be asked, why would we fund something that protects ponds that are not accessible to people in the public? Why are we talking about everything as opposed to just those ponds that are used by the public? And I would encourage the town and the Pond Coalition to have a response to that.
Well, let me pick up on your latter point first. All groundwater in Brewster is connected. So protecting only the major public use ponds doesn't necessarily protect all the groundwater. You know, there is downgrading effects, whether it's wells, public and private, or the bay or whatever. So the interconnections are important. At the same time, you want to focus on, you know, the septic systems that impact waters. If they are out in the middle of the woods and hundreds, 500 feet away from anything, then it's likely that that septic system is never going to impact the groundwater of Brewster in any usable form, whether it's a pond or a well. On your former point, public education is essential. We have a significant number of summer use houses. Somebody probably knows better than I do, but something 30–40% of the houses in Brewster are second homes or not owner occupied. There is no question that non-owner occupied homes can often have more problematic septic systems than owner occupied homes. First of all, because septic systems work best when they have a constant load that's going into them. They do not work as well, both in terms of bacterial and nutrient reductions, when you've got no flow for 8 months in the winter, and then all of a sudden you hit it with a lot of flow in the summer. And the bugs aren't developed in the septic system to eat the nutrients or eat the waste. So not only do second homes have problems related to effectiveness of their septic systems in working, they also have issues that people may not care as much. Hence, you know, I've rented this for a week. I don't care what I throw down the septic system. So I agree with your point that some way to educate people when they rent properties, when they move into houses, post on the refrigerator or something to prevent misuse of septic systems is a good target for us to focus on in our education efforts. I'm looking over at Susan so she can nod on that. So yeah, terrific idea.
Could I comment on that?
Since we share two very large ponds, Seymour, Long Pond, with the township of Harwich, is there communication and or cooperation with them as far as water quality, use of ponds?
Consider them.
The ponds, maybe if you just ask questions, shout when you ask them. The Ponds Coalition is having discussions with a good number of other pond associations. You know, we've had discussions with Orleans. I've certainly met with Barnstable. I'm not sure what we've done with Harwich yet, but we're certainly aware of them, and there's been some communication. Moreover, the town is certainly doing that. They're not working alone, intimately aware that when it comes to the Herring River watershed, that planning for that watershed to meet the new state Title V regulations has got to be done together with Harwich. They need to calculate the nitrogen load from the Brewster side of that watershed, which means basically the south side of Long Pond and Seymour Pond, and from the Harwich side, to come up with the overall nitrogen reductions that will be needed to protect the Herring River estuary and Nantucket Sound in that area. And there's also no question that that area is impaired. Anybody who's been down to the West Reservoir in Harwich this summer, you can smell the impairment. The water turned green. I think the APCC has got a good picture of how green that turned. But yes, the town is intimately aware the need to work with the other towns. They are working together with Orleans, Chatham, and Harwich on Pleasant Bay, aware of what we need to do with Harwich on the Herring River, and I'm sure we'll be talking on that small area that drains to the Bass River, be talking with Dennis.
Getting back to pumping septic systems, does it help if, does pumping more regularly, more often help? And if so, is it possible that people with summer rentals, there could be a requirement that they get annual pumping? For now, I know that's not an ultimate solution.
Short answer is no. More pumping does not make a septic system work better. No pumping makes the septic system fail. So the recommendation historically has been 3 years to pump out septic systems. At least it should be inspected every 3 years to see what the level of it is. That sludge that accumulates in the bottom of the septic tank is a reservoir of active bacteria and microbes that help the decomposition of the new waste come in. So you don't want to eliminate that, just keep it removing it. You want to have a healthy population in there. You also don't want to fill up the septic tank so that there's no water, no capacity in the tank to take in water. But yearly pumping, no. Every 10 years, no. But the recommendation is 3 years, or at least inspect it every 3 years, and then and pump out as needed.
Is there a way to regulate that to ensure that people are doing that every 3 years? Just
I don't know what the regulations are. Somebody, Kim, do you know what the regulations are?
We can mandate it, but we have not.
We can mandate it?
Through the Board of Health, in your hands.
Right back at you.
Right back at it. Okay. Board of Health will think about it.
I'm sorry, Judge, just one more thing. You mentioned annual inspections. It does depend on the type of system you have. So for example, if you have a pressure dose system, it should be inspected annually.
Good. I'm sure that some of us older folks can't quite hear that.
I just wanted to add one thing about how often to look at your septic system. If you have what's called a pressure dose system, and you may or may not know that you have that, but that needs to be inspected by an engineer every year.
Yeah.
Any other questions? He's really helping me.
So is it safe to say that poorly, older septic systems, cesspools and alike are contributing to bad actors? And if that's the case, do we have an idea of how many cesspools we have that are close to ponds and things like that? And if we do, why couldn't we just regulate, they go to Title V right away?
There's 4 types of septic systems, not 5, I've got 5. And the oldest is the outhouse, where you don't have good bacterial decontamination and the water just flows out without any other control. And that's going to have the most concentrated pile of nutrients and the greatest amount of nutrients moving through a narrow column in the groundwater. And then you have cesspools. And we don't have any outhouses. I hope we don't have any outhouses left in Brewster. Then you have the cesspools. Cesspools is basically all the waste goes into a big tank. It's surrounded by a permeable set of stones or concrete. Pretty concentrated, not good destruction of bacterial destruction. Decomposition of the waste to get rid of harmful bacteria. Those have been outlawed for some time. There are presumably none of those left. However, there may be some because, it's really hard and some of the houses are really old. And we hear anecdotal stories that there may be some left. But they are outlawed, and if they're found, they're supposed to be upgraded. So we shouldn't have a lot of that. However, a lot of those existed in the houses going back centuries. Certainly my great-grandfather's house in the middle of town had one of those. I used that as a kid. So the impact of those is probably still around in the older sections of town. A more common system in older houses is the leach pit. There you have a septic system, a septic tank, Title V approved, and rather than going to a leach field, which goes to a round pit, you're now getting the good bacterial destruction, waste destruction in the septic tank. You're going into the leach pit, the nutrients and the water goes out to the leach pit. That's more concentrated than the next level up, which is a leach field, which spreads it out further. The leach pits more likely are going to have a more concentrated plume of nutrients that are flowing down gradient towards a pond or whatever. Part of the study that we're looking at includes both leach fields and leach pits to try to determine what the difference is between those. We have a lot of leach pit systems in Brewster, I mean thousands, okay? And then there's the leach field, which is the best, the modern Title V spreads things out over a wider area. And as Kim mentioned, a lot of the newer systems, we're increasingly seeing pressure pump systems. They are particularly designed to remove nitrogen. They have 2 tanks and a pump up system. And the pump needs to be maintained, and there's some maintenance and reporting requirements on those more sophisticated systems. And they are designed to remove particularly nitrogen in most of those pressure dose systems. So it spans the spectrum, and we need to consider all of that. Right now, there is no consideration amongst anybody that we would blanket say all leach pits need to be upgraded to a leach field. That would be horribly expensive, and we don't have the evidence to say that that's needed. My personal bet is it won't be needed, but it's going to be a matter of distance from ponds, all those factors that I mentioned in the presentation. Other questions?
John, thank you for this. Some of us have lawns. We may not love it, but we have houses that have lawns. And we're struggling with how to reduce the application of fertilizers that contain nitrogen. So, as I understand it, phosphorus is already prohibited.
It's supposed to be, but you could unfortunately still buy it. But hopefully you're not.
Well, I had a long conversation with one of the companies that provides lawn services. Our company happens to be True Green. Looked at all of their applications, 6 a year, there's no phosphorus anywhere. I think maybe that's typical. But each one of those applications had nitrogen. And so I said to them, how can we reduce our application of nitrogen? And what he told me, I'd like to verify this with you, is that there are some neighboring towns that have adopted regulations around this issue. And that in prime season, when the grass is really growing, June and July, nitrogen is permitted in the fertilizer applications those months. But in the earlier part of the spring, and then in August and September when growth slows down, a substitute set of nutrients is used that do not include nitrogen, iron, and some other minerals and so on. And if you went from 6 applications of nitrogen a year to just say 3 applications and the rest used to substitute, if we all did that, we would be reducing our nitrogen applications by half. I mean, that's not trivial. So I guess my question is, and the neighboring communities that do this include Orleans and Chatham, Falmouth, you mentioned. I guess my question is this perhaps a regulatory approach that Brewster should be considering? It seems on its face like it would be helpful.
Americans have a fascination with lawns. Something, I hate to mow lawns, so I don't have a lawn here. If you add all the American lawns together, you get an area larger than the state of Georgia. So it's a big issue nationwide. Ideally, no more nitrogen should be put on a lawn. Well, ideally, we minimize the amount of lawn. And we use native vegetation, we use native plantings. The Ponds Coalition has had several discussions and adult presentations about native landscaping, and we certainly favor that. People do like to play on lawns. My grandkids like to play on lawns. My grandson kicks that soccer ball all the time. So there are going to be some lawns. Ideally, you should not put more nitrogen on a lawn than the plants can take up. And that nitrogen needs to be applied in dry weather with a minimum amount of water application so that the nitrogen stays within the root zone of the grass and does not go down into the groundwater. And is certainly not done any time period of rain, because the worst nitrogen pollution from lawns occurs when they just fertilized it and then it rains and then you get immediate runoff. Clearly an area for public education, clearly an area for education of the many landscaping firms that are around there. A lot of that's been done. There's money to be saved. There's no point putting nitrogen on that's not being used by the grass. That's only wasting money. Is it an area for regulation? I'm personally hesitant to say, develop a whole lot of regulations that are extraordinarily difficult to enforce. Because, how do you manage and monitor that? I'm hopeful that through education of both the public and the landscapers, we can get this under control. Can't rule out regulation, but there's going to be a lot of different views on how that's going to work.
Can we ask you to also answer that question
I'm sorry?
about the fertilizer? Because that was the insert that was in the water department.
Thank you, Susan. The insert in the water bills, which I hope was good because I designed it. Spoke mostly to the issue of phosphate, but also if you have questions about your soil, so you could potentially be applying fertilizer to a perfectly balanced soil. The state will actually test your soil for you. You just have to give them a sample. And if it comes back that you have adequate nitrogen, phosphorus, etc. in your soils, you may not need to apply anything at all. It's kind of a habit that we've all gotten into over the years, and maybe one that certainly in a lot of cases we can break. And one more thing I have to say, I took the plunge and went to Clover Lawn. And soccer balls do roll on Clover Lawns. You can trim them. And I get so many compliments about how nicely my flowers are doing this year, because guess who likes the Clover Lawn better than the garden? Those rabbits. Exactly. So how do you keep your flowers? Do you have traps for the rabbits? No, I have clover for the rabbits.
Any other? We need to wrap up fairly soon. We're going on to some length.
I just have one comment to make. I'm Marcia Calvin. I'm the chair of the Education Committee, which means we'll be working very hard to do more educating of the public, obviously. Right now, I know Susan mentioned our pond protection program. We are really is starting to spread the word about it at 3 ponds because there's not enough of us. We need more volunteers. Kevin Kearns is working with Canoe Pond, Marty Burke is working with Upper Mill Pond, and I just want you to know, anybody that wants to pick up any information on this, as you go out, we have information. It has a list of EPA recommendations of what goes down into your septic system. This document is actually like a 46-page document. So we just have the front page and a recommendation where to go to the website to find out what the EPA recommends. And we are spreading this along with our pond protection program to neighborhoods that are on ponds, to the HOAs or that are close to the ponds. So thank you very much.
Any final questions before we turn it over? We'll take just like 2 more.
Just one quick question, back to the septic system. Does it help to put something in the septic system like Red X or some of those? I've heard both ways.
No.
Okay. Well, some do, but I didn't know.
I want to comment on the laws following up with Tim's day. I mean, I have a property in New York State that does have a lawn, and I have never fertilized it. And it grows terrifically well for those soccer balls. So you don't necessarily need a lot of nutrients, except when you're establishing a new lawn. That's pretty well clear that you need nutrients. But most lawns can do very well, provided you don't take the grass away. You allow the nutrients to be recycled in the soil. Any other? Marty?
John, one question here back to ponds is there's a lot to unpack. It was a great presentation, so thank you. With regard, it seems like maybe the first step or one of the initial steps would be to analyze the existing data that we have. We have Mill Ponds data, we have PAL's data since 2001 that we started looking at, and then the town is now looking at it. We also have BPC cyanobacteria data now cataloged for 7 years. So, and I'm sure I'm missing some other reports that are out there. It would seem that analyzing that existing data would be important for us to get a sense of where ponds are balanced and ponds are unbalanced. So, is there a timetable and a collaboration between, I would expect, the town consultants and maybe BPC in looking at this?
Well, Chris Miller could probably comment better than I can. Last I heard, the town approved funding for the evaluation of all the historical PALS data, and certainly is aware of all the cyanobacteria data. And I'm hearing, I think it was December, we're looking for a report on that evaluation of the data. So,
excellent.
That's your time frame. So I want to get that sort of evaluation done. Well, thank you very much.
Well, I want to thank John very much. We're very lucky to have him on the board of the Brewster Ponds Coalition and also here in town. So thank you very much. Thanks for your presentation. Before I adjourn the meeting, we had a raffle. So Mary, do you want to?
Susan Bridges.
You have to pick a different name. That's not fair.
Timothy had to leave, he's not here right
Oh,
now.
all right. We'll save it for him.
George Penner.
Oh, yeah. Wait, we only have 2. Yeah, we only got 2.
Okay, only got 2.
Yeah. So, I want to thank Agway of Cape Cod for sponsoring this program. Agway of Cape Cod is co-owned by a brother and sister team, Josh Wild and Jessica Thomas. and thank them for these door prizes. Also, very important, I have said it before and I'm gonna say it again, I really wanna thank all of our members and our volunteers that make all of this work possible. And thank you very much for coming out today as well. And all of our business partners, I've been mentioning them a lot today, we have a lot of them, and we appreciate what they do for us. So I will adjourn the meeting, and I hope everyone has a wonderful weekend, and thank you very much for coming.